The transmission was supposed to be static, just another piece of the grim background noise of a war winding down in its own bloody, unsatisfying way, but for Captain Eva Rostova, the broken signal screaming through her headset was a live wire straight into hell. They called the mission impossible, she called it Tuesday. Deep in the fog-shrouded, jagged valleys of the Zoran Expanse, a place nicknamed the Gauntlet by the few who'd made it out, the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, 340 souls, had been declared combat ineffective, surrounded and written off by a command too politically cautious to authorize a suicide run. The official word was contained attrition, a sterile, gutless phrase that meant they were left to die, their sacrifice a convenient bargaining chip for generals and politicians a world away. Eva, a flight officer whose file was thicker with reprimands than commendations, listened to the desperate, encrypted pleas, the coordinates, the casualty counts dwindling as the enemy closed in, the final, resigned voice of a young lieutenant saying, "Tell our families we held the line." That was the moment protocol died. Protocol wouldn't save them. Only a miracle would. And Eva Rostova was fresh out of those. She would have to build one herself from stolen aircraft, insubordination, and a fury that burned colder than the void of space. Her first move wasn't to the hangar but to the Datanet, a shadow war waged in the digital trenches of the fleet's command structure. She forged Priority 1 logistical orders, rerouted a trio of heavy-lift Dragonfly transports slated for a routine supply run, and faked a commander's signature with an artistry born of practice. She didn't recruit a crew, she collected them, a band of misfits, burnouts, and idealists who, like her, remembered the old promise, no one gets left behind. There was Jagged Jax, a pilot who could thread a needle in a hurricane, whose career was stalled after questioning a bad call that got men killed. There was Doc Hollis, a medic who spent more time in the brig for fighting than in the infirmary, but whose hands were a steady promise of life in a world bent on delivering death. They were 7 in total, a number that felt both sacrilegious and fitting against the 340 they aimed to save. The plan was a tapestry of insanity woven with thin threads of hope. They would fly nap of the Earth, skimming the terrifyingly dense atmosphere of the planet to avoid orbital detection, using the planet's own violent magnetic storms as cover. They would drop into the Gauntlet not with the thunder of an armada, but with the silence of ghosts, hoping the enemy had grown complacent, believing the trapped Marines were already as good as dead. The descent was a controlled fall into madness. The Dragonflies bucked and shuddered, their hulls groaning in protest against winds that tore at the craft like claws. Outside the viewport, the world was a bruise of purple and black, lit intermittently by silent flashes of lightning that illuminated jagged peaks reaching up like teeth to devour them. Inside, the only sound was the tense chatter of navigation and the constant, low hum of systems pushed far beyond their design limits. Eva's mind was a map of trajectories and threats, every decision a potential epitaph for 7 more souls. They broke through the final cloud layer, and the sight below stole the breath from her lungs. The Gauntlet was a killing field. The scorched earth was littered with the husks of armored vehicles and the faint, tragic glow of dying emergency beacons. In the center, a tight perimeter had been established around a craggy hill, a last bastion where the remaining Marines made their stand. As the Dragonflies flared for landing, enemy fire began to pepper the hull, a light rain at first that quickly escalated into a torrential storm. They were expected. This was the first twist, the gut punch that told Eva their mission, for all its secrecy, was no secret at all. Someone had talked, or worse, someone had always known. The ramps dropped not onto solid ground, but into chaos. The Marines on the ground were not the proud, disciplined force of recruitment posters, they were ghosts in uniform, their faces hollowed out by exhaustion, their eyes holding the 1,000-yard stare of men who had already accepted their graves. They moved with a sluggish, automated desperation, returning fire against an enemy that seemed to flow from the very rocks themselves. Eva and her team hit the dirt running, establishing a frantic, mobile perimeter as the Marines began their boarding process. It was slow, too slow. The enemy had dug in positions all around the LZ, and they were using advanced suppression fire, hurting the Marines, not just killing them. It was then that Eva saw him, Colonel James Thorne, the battalion commander, his arm in a sling, his face a mask of grime and grim determination. He grabbed her arm, his voice a raw scrape over the din of battle. "They're not trying to overrun us, Captain," he yelled. "They're pinning us for the big one. They have a particle beam battery on the ridge." They were waiting for a bigger prize. The realization was a physical blow. The 340 weren't the target, they were the bait. Command had written them off, but the enemy command had counted on the sentimental, no man left behind ethos of the Marines. They were waiting for the real rescue force, the carriers and gunships, to fly into a trap that would cripple the fleet's local dominance. Eva's ragtag, unauthorized mission was an unforeseen variable, a spanner in the works, but it wouldn't be enough to stop the hammer from falling. Time seemed to warp, stretching and compressing in the violent rhythm of combat. The dragonflies were taking critical hits, their armor straining. One of the 7, a young engineer named Chen, was cut down by a sniper as he tried to patch a ruptured fuel line. They loaded his body onto the transport, a silent, angry addition to the cargo of living men. They were at 80% loaded when the air itself began to hum, a deep, resonant frequency that vibrated in their teeth and bones. The particle beam battery on the ridge was powering up. In minutes, it would unleash a lance of pure energy that would vaporize the LZ and everything on it. The mission was on the brink of a catastrophic, total failure. They would all die, and the enemy's trap would still be sprung for the next, more official, wave of rescuers. It was in this crucible of impossible choices that the second, more personal twist emerged. As Eva coordinated a desperate, last-ditch suppression run with the Dragonfly's chin guns, Colonel Thorne looked at her, a strange, appraising look in his eyes. "Rostova," he said, his voice suddenly calm amidst the storm. "Your father, he would have been proud of this insane stunt." Eva froze, her blood running cold. Her father, a legendary commander, had died in a similar scenario, written off as a loss in a politically inconvenient battle. Thorne had served with him. He knew the ghost that drove her, the legacy she was simultaneously running from and trying to honor. This wasn't just a rescue to him, it was a redemption of a past failure. He had been broadcasting more than just distress signals, he'd been broadcasting a specific, coded call for help, a call he knew only one person with Rostova's particular brand of reckless brilliance and a personal vendetta would answer. The revelation ignited something within her, a clarity that cut through the fear and the noise. The enemy was predictable. They were focused on the big picture, the fleet-killing blow. They wouldn't be expecting an attack on their greatest asset, not from the inside of the trap itself. Abandoning the LZ command post, she sprinted to Jagged Jax's Dragonfly, the one they called the Gremlin. "New plan," she barked, hauling herself into the co-pilot's seat. "We're not running from the beam. We're taking it offline." Jax, without a second's hesitation, just grinned, a wild, feral thing. "Now you're speaking my language, Cap." The Gremlin lifted off, not vertically into a retreat, but forward, skimming the terrain at a suicidal pace, using the chaos in the landscape as its only shield. Alarms blared as targeting locks tried and failed to find them. The hum of the particle beam intensified, a rising scream promising annihilation. They weaved through a canyon, the rock walls blurring past the canopy, and burst out directly at the base of the ridge where the massive weapon was housed. It was heavily guarded by infantry, but its one vulnerability was its power source, a series of exposed plasma conduits running up the cliff face. "Doc, take the controls," Jax yelled, unbuckling. He grabbed a heavy rifle and slid open the side hatch, the wind tearing at him. He laid down a precise, devastating pattern of fire, striking the conduits. The first few shots sparked and fizzled. Then, one hit true. A chain reaction of blue-white energy raced up the conduit, and the humming reached a fever pitch before cutting off into indeafening silence, followed by a secondary explosion that lit up the ridge in a fireball that consumed the battery. The trap was sprung on itself. Back at the LZ, the sudden silence from the ridge was a signal of its own. The enemy, confused and suddenly vulnerable, faltered. The remaining Marines, seeing their chance, fought with a renewed, final reserve of strength, pushing back and completing the boarding under the cover of the other 2 Dragonfly's guns. The Gremlin, smoking and battered, slid back into the LZ just long enough for Jax and Eva to jump out and onto the last transport. They lifted off as the ground beneath them was swarmed. The ascent was no less violent, but now it was a retreat toward hope, not into a trap. They broke orbit, leaving the hell of the gauntlet behind, carrying 323 living Marines out of the 340. They had left 17 more behind, but they had brought back 323 men from the dead. When they docked with the fleet, they were not met with cheers, but with armed MPs and the stony faces of high command. Eva Rostova was immediately placed under arrest. The charges were insubordination, theft of military property, and reckless endangerment. She stood in the sterile briefing room, facing her accusers, the weight of her actions finally settling on her. She had no regrets. Then, the doors opened, and Colonel Thorne, his uniform torn but his posture ramrod straight, entered. He placed a data slate on the table. "Before you court-martial the officer who just saved 323 Marines and prevented the destruction of the 7th Fleet," he said, his voice echoing in the silent room, "you might want to review this. It's a complete log of the command-level communications that deliberately abandoned my battalion and left us as bait. Captain Rostova didn't break protocol, gentlemen. She exposed a betrayal that shames this uniform far more than any of her actions ever could." The court-martial was not just dismissed, it was buried. The ensuing scandal tore through the command structure, leading to resignations and courts-martial for those who had sanctioned the original, horrific decision. Eva Rostova, the woman who they called reckless, who broke every rule in the book, was quietly awarded the Star of Valor, not for her bravery in combat, but for her unwavering loyalty in the face of calculated betrayal. They called it impossible. She just called it doing what was right.